River Phoenix. At 23 years old, River Phoenix was already being called the finest actor of his generation. And in 3 months, he'd be dead on a sidewalk outside one of the most famous nightclubs in Los Angeles. By the early 1990s, Phoenix wasn't just a working actor. He was the industry's golden child. He'd earned an Academy Award nomination at 18 for his supporting role in a drama about a father hiding his son from the FBI. Directors described him as instinctive, someone who didn't act so much as simply exist in front of the camera. He was raised outside the traditional studio system, homeschooled, vegan before it was fashionable, deeply private about his personal life, even as his public profile exploded. By 1993, he was attached to major studio projects, was close friends with several of the era's rising names, and had just wrapped work on a psychological drama that would later be seen as a haunting foreshadowing of his own decline. Friends who worked with him that year described a young man who seemed exhausted in a way that didn't match his age, someone carrying more weight than a 23-year-old should have to carry. On the night of October 30th, 1993, Phoenix was at the Viper Room, a club he partly co-owned, when he began convulsing on the sidewalk outside. Paramedics arrived within minutes, but by the time he reached Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, he had already suffered cardiac arrest, brought on by a combination of substances in his system. He was pronounced dead in the early hours of Halloween morning. The 911 call, made by his younger brother, would later become one of the most replayed pieces of audio in tabloid history, a devastating public artifact of a private family tragedy. In the years since, Phoenix has become something of a cautionary patron saint for young Hollywood, a name invoked every time a new prodigy is called the next big thing a little too early. The films he left unfinished were quietly reworked or recast, and the industry that had rushed to elevate him spent the rest of the decade reckoning with how little support it had actually given him. 2. Brandon Lee. He was 28 years old, 1 week from finishing his breakout role, when a prop gun that should never have been loaded ended his life on set. Brandon Lee spent his entire life trying to step out from under an enormous shadow. His father had redefined martial arts cinema, and by the early 1990s, Brandon was finally carving out his own identity as an action star in his own right. He'd trained for years, studied acting seriously, and landed the lead role in a dark, stylish supernatural thriller that industry insiders were already predicting would make him a star, independent of his family name. Production had been plagued by minor accidents for weeks. A mishap with a car, an electrical fire on set, the kind of thing crews chalk up to a difficult shoot rather than a warning sign. Lee himself had reportedly grown uneasy, telling those close to him that something about the production felt off, though he pushed through, focused on finishing what he believed would be the role that finally made him more than his father's son. On March 31st, 1993, during a scene requiring a close-range gunshot, the prop firearm discharged what turned out to be a dummy round with a bullet fragment lodged in the barrel from an earlier, improperly checked take. Lee was struck in the abdomen. He was rushed to a hospital in Wilmington, North Carolina, but doctors were unable to stop the internal bleeding. He died hours later, with roughly a week of filming left on the production. The studio ultimately used a body double and early CGI compositing to complete his remaining scenes, and the film was released the following year to strong reviews, many of which noted the eerie resonance between the story's themes of death and resurrection and the tragedy behind its making. The incident became a permanent turning point in film set firearm safety protocols, a legacy Lee never intended, but one that has likely prevented further deaths in the decades since. 3. Heath Ledger. 6 months before the world would call Heath Ledger's performance one of the greatest in the history of the genre, Heath Ledger was already gone. By late 2007, Ledger had spent nearly a decade being underestimated, dismissed early in his career as just another handsome face from Australian television, before roles in an unconventional Western romance and a string of independent films slowly proved otherwise. Then came the part that would change everything, a menacing, unpredictable villain in the follow-up to a billion-dollar superhero franchise. Colleagues described his preparation as almost frighteningly immersive. He reportedly isolated himself for weeks, kept a private notebook of the character's psychology, and struggled to sleep for months during and after filming. He'd also just become a father, and friends said he seemed to be trying to balance the demands of the role with a genuine desire to be present for his young daughter, often flying back and forth between productions and home. On January 22, 2008, Ledger was found unresponsive in his Soho apartment in New York City by his housekeeper and a masseuse who had arrived for a scheduled appointment. He was 28. The official autopsy determined the cause of death to be acute intoxication from a combination of prescription medications, sleeping aids, anti-anxiety drugs, and painkillers he'd reportedly been taking to manage the insomnia that had plagued him during production. The medical examiner classified it as accidental. 6 months later, that unfinished film was released, and the performance he'd nearly destroyed his own sleep to build was met with universal acclaim. The following year, he became one of the only actors in history to win a posthumous Academy Award, an honor his family accepted on his behalf, turning what should have been a career triumph into one of the most bittersweet nights in the ceremony's history. 4. James Dean. James Dean made exactly 3 films. He was 24 years old, and he was driving a car nicknamed Little Bastard when it happened. Before he became one of the defining faces of American cinema, James Dean was a restless kid from Indiana who'd bounced between New York theater work and small television roles, desperate for a part that matched his intensity. He found it in a coming-of-age family drama that made him an overnight sensation, quickly followed by a role as a disaffected teenager in a film that would come to define an entire generation's image of youthful alienation. By September 1955, he had one more film already in the can, awaiting release, and a genuine passion for auto racing that ran parallel to his acting career. He'd recently purchased a brand new Porsche 550 Spyder, a car built for speed, and was driving it to a racing event in Salinas, California, confident, according to those who knew him, that his skill behind the wheel matched his instincts in front of the camera. On September 30th, 1955, on a rural highway intersection near Colomé, California, another driver making a left turn failed to see Dean's low-profile silver Porsche approaching and pulled directly into its path. The two cars collided almost head-on. Dean was killed almost instantly from the impact. His passenger survived with serious injuries. He had been driving to a race he would never compete in, and in a car he had nicknamed as a joke. 2 of his 3 films, including the one that would earn him a posthumous Oscar nomination, were released after his death, meaning much of the world first came to know James Dean as a name attached to tragedy rather than a living actor. The wrecked remains of the Porsche were later blamed, half jokingly and half seriously, for a string of unrelated accidents and misfortunes among those who came into contact with it, a piece of Hollywood folklore that only deepened the myth of a man who died before he ever got to see how famous he'd become. 4 actors, 4 different decades, 4 completely different circumstances, an overdose, a set accident, a prescription mix-up, a car crash. But the same haunting thread runs through all of it. Talent that never got to finish saying what it had to say. It raises an uncomfortable question worth sitting with. How many performances, how many careers were we robbed of simply because Hollywood chews people up faster than they can catch their breath? If you'd like to see more stories like this, make sure to subscribe and feel free to drop suggestions for the next video in the comments.